Iowa City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who have contributed their ideas, their gifts, and their energy to the life of Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who have affected this community. Their contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions are they the most pleased about? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled, Tell Me Your Story. Paul Engle is an amazing man. Amazing in that he is a poet, a teacher, a prose writer, an administrator, a fundraiser, a spotter of talent, and a nurturer of writers. He was born and raised on a farm near Cedar Rapids, graduated from Coe College in 1931, and after a year at Columbia University, he became a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Paul is the former director of the University of Iowa's famed Writers' Workshop and the former co-director of the U of I International Writing Program. He established the Translation Workshop in 1976. Paul Engle is U of I Professor Emeritus of Creative Writing. His many honors include a nomination, along with Walling Nee Engle, for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a past member of the National Council on the Arts, and just recently he received the 1990 Award of Distinguished Service to the Arts given by the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. Engle is the first Iowan to win the award and the second person to win it west of the Mississippi. An amazing man and my guest on Tell Me Your Story. Paul, you were the son of a farmer horse trader and you grew up delivering rented carriages and newspapers and soda jerking. And where did this love of poetry and prose come from?
When I was a little kid, which to a certain extent I assume I still am, I had a granduncle, my father's uncle, who was a sort of frontier doctor. He wrote poetry. I have two of his books of poetry. When I was at Oxford, I went to the Bodleian Library, where I worked part-time, and just for fun, looked in the catalog under Engle. To my distress, none of my books were there, but great Uncle Engle's books were there. They were poetry about the Indians in Michigan, where he lived. And then when I was very small in school, I began to read something I have not stopped. And a teacher gave me an anthology. She said, I noticed that you read all of the poems that I assigned to the class, but you read more. And so she gave me an anthology. And it was the first modern poetry I'd ever read. And it had an enormous effect on me. And so I never stopped. I'm still writing poetry and prose, so that it's been a lifelong joy.
You grew up, like I said, on this farm, and you ended up in Oxford. Was that quite a cultural shock for you coming? I know It was
a cultural shock to me, but it was also a cultural shock for Oxford. And I must make one small correction.
Yes.
Please forgive. I didn't grow up on a farm.
Oh, you
My
did.
mother and father grew up on farms near Marion, Iowa. But my father's business was horses. And very young, I learned to harness horses, drive horses. I drove work wagons for the telephone company, and also saddle horses. I grew up on horseback. My right elbow has cinders in it from being thrown. And I must say, one of the great experiences of my life, and one of the most terrifying, was when I would hitch up a horse to a telephone wagon, which had spools of wire in it, spindles for wire, cups for melting lead, wire of all kinds, big wire, little wire, and hooks for strapping on your ankles if you were a worker for the telephone company, and climbing telephone poles which had no other way of getting up. And I would drive one horse with my left hand and lead the other with my right hand. Now, At that time, Cedar Rapids had an enormous number of railroad trains going through, very wide crossing, big tracks. And horses are terrified of train whistles. And I was terrified of the fact they were terrified. And I only once had a bad experience. And my father said, no matter what happens, don't let go of the horses. And so we had just started to cross, and all of a sudden a big switch engine came down and whistled very loud. So the horses did what a horse always does. They went straight up in the air, and I had to hang on like this. I was perhaps 14 at the time, and I thought, here it goes. They're going to throw me, probably under the train. But I hung on, which was my salvation. Of course, it was for my security and for the horses' security. And I finally got them, all four legs down, and I got them across, and the train went by. And then I went to an alley in Cedar Rapids, in the business district, between 4th Avenue and 3rd Avenue, and tied them up to telephone poles, which were wrapped with wire because many horses chew wood, and they didn't want their telephone poles chewed down.
Well, at Oxford, I know horses weren't your business. Study was. You did some rowing, and you traveled a lot while you were at Oxford, right?
You know, I discovered when there that the sort of life I led as a young kid in Cedar Rapids, a city of which I'm very fond, was perfect preparation for Oxford, because I had a background that these Oxford boys not only didn't have, but which they couldn't conceive. I worked with farmers. I spent summers on the farm where my mother was born. I milked cows. I slopped hogs. I drove horses pulling a plow or a harrow, a rake, hay rake. And I knew all kinds of people who were unlike any that these public school, very well indeed educated English young men had ever met, didn't want to meet. So it gave me a big advantage. I got along great with my servants. Imagine, here I was with a little horse manure in my shoes, and which impressed my scout. The servant, your servant is called a scout.
I see.
Very much, because there was a bit of the old stuff on one of them, and he said my first morning, I say, sir, you have horses? Although he called it horses. And I said, yes. And he said, more than one? And I said, 16. Now, that absolutely impressed him. It was a total lie, of course. I didn't have 16 horses. My father had 16 in his business. My scout thought that we were so wealthy, instead of being so dirt poor. I mean, the horses got their oats after we ate our oatmeal in the morning. And so I went up in his estimation socially.
Was this at about the same time that something very remarkable happened to you, besides being at Oxford and traveling like you did? About 1934, in the New York Times book review, the entire front page was devoted to a review of your poetry book, American Song, a Book of Poems. The headline read, "A New Voice in American Poetry." What was your reaction to this? Were you astounded, amazed?
I'm still reacting. And I must be honest and tell you, it never happened again to any of the other books I wrote. But may I just tell you, this wonderful experience. I had a friend, an American, who lived in New York. His great-grandfather was Joel Barlow, one of the first American poets, first American ambassador to the court of France. And he had, as one says, quite a lot of money. House on Gramercy Park, house on Cape Cod, house in France, apartment in Paris. And I met him by blind chance on my way to Oxford, on the ship in the middle of the night, just before we reached Europe. And I went up to the bar and sat down, if you will forgive the expression. And there were two gentlemen at the next table. And after a while, one of them said, come and have a drink with us. And I thanked him. And we talked and talked, and finally he said, I suppose you write poetry. And I said, isn't it wonderful you've read it? He said, no, never heard of you. But you look and talk like somebody who writes poetry.
And there you were on the front page of the New York
And
Times.
so that Christmas he spent at this tiny little village of Eze, E-Z-E, which is midway between Nice and Monte Carlo. And he said, come for Christmas. And I said, Sam, his name was Samuel Barlow, Christmas vacation at Oxford is 6 weeks. And he said, well, it was obvious. This was rather a shock to him, you know. He said, come for 8 weeks. We got a special little building for you there, my studio. He was a composer. He studied with the Respighi, whose most famous work, The Pines of Rome, he referred to as the broccoli of Rome. And he said, don't wait, come the first night. So I took the train down from Paris to Nice. He met me there, and we drove along. There are 3 highways connecting the 2 cities. One is called the Corniche-sur-Mer. Corniche is kind of a road there. The highway on the sea, then there was the Moyen Corniche, where the village of Eze was. Then there was the Haute Corniche, which was a very high one. We couldn't go up there. The French had forts with artillery, and you're not allowed to go. So we climbed and climbed, and suddenly we came out into this medieval city. It was all stone, and it had never had a wheeled vehicle, not even a bicycle. The streets were all steps and too narrow. So I lived there for the 6 weeks, and Christmas Eve, he said, hey, I got some people coming for dinner. And I said, anybody I know? And he said, certainly not. You wouldn't have any clue who these people are. And I said, well, maybe you could whisper their names. And he said, I'll introduce you when they come. The first person to arrive was named Vladimir Horowitz. The second was Gregor Piatigorsky, the cellist, and the other was Nathan Milstein, the violinist. Finally, the fourth came. Not a performing musician, he was a pianist. He came from Greece. His name was Dimitri Mitropoulos. Now, these were my 4 dinner guests. And after dinner, served on this marvelous terrace. You could see snow on the mountains of Corsica over the blue Mediterranean. You couldn't see the island. The snow floated on the water. And Piatigorsky said something to Horowitz, who was waiting to be asked, of course, in particular because his bride-to-be was there, Wanda Toscanini. And he wanted to impress her. So instead of playing straightforward Chopin mazurkas, he played all of the most dramatic pieces he could think of, including using elbows. I mean, he was out of control. And Miss Toscanini sat there absolutely expressionless. She was not going to let this male musician intimidate her. So I went back then for future vacations there, but others I spent in Germany. I had to learn German for my degree in philosophy, and I knew none. I lived with a Bavarian peasant family. I felt right at home. I lived in the room above the barn where the oxen were. They used oxen. Nobody had a horse, couldn't afford a horse. I learned to drive oxen. I wore leather shorts and heavy farm boots, and I learned to give commands to oxen in German. And I had a 10-foot-long pole. I would tap them. I had to call these directions in German. The first time I did, I swear on my heart that they stopped and looked around at me. They'd never heard an accent like mine before.
Paul, what pulled you back to Iowa? What brought you back here? I know you came back to teach, and then you got into the writing program, but what was the pull that brought you back?
Desperation and anticipation. I liked Iowa, and living in Berlin, in Paris, in London, Oxford, Warsaw, where I did, Vienna, it simply made me not sentimental, but just thinking, well, when I go back, I want to live in Iowa a while. I've had this sort of culture, and so I think when I go back, I'll go home. Mm-hmm. And I had an offer of a job before I got here, got to Cedar Rapids, I should say, to teach at a very fine small college in New England called Amherst. Mm-hmm. And I was very tempted, because that was a very famous place, and the poet Robert Frost was there, and I was tempted. Instead of which, I did something which turned out to be very rewarding. A lecture agency in New York called me when I was in New York and said, come and see us. So I did. They were the biggest lecture agency in New York. I had no job. By then I had told Amherst no. Mm-hmm. And he said, look, I think you could lecture. I said, to whom should I lecture? And he said, anybody that'll pay you, and me. So I said, well, I'm willing to try anything. And so he sent me around, and I lectured at college commencements. I lectured at women's clubs, women's literary societies. I've lectured in every state in the Union, and I think every state university and endless colleges. I made my living doing that. Mm-hmm. And I've lectured in East Europe. Last year we were in Belgrade for an international conference. This summer we go to Korea, Hong Kong, so on. And then I've lectured in Asia a lot, in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and China, India, Indonesia, Philippines.
But you ended back here.
So I always wanted to come home. And one day I got a call from a man named Norman Foerster, who was director of the School of Letters. He said, I'd like to talk to you. So I did the usual act, you know, saying, well, of course, I'm rather busy, and all this kind of nonsense. And he said, well, at your pleasure, of course. So I came down, and he said, I think I could use you in the School of Letters. And we talked a while. And he said, well, in fact, I asked you here, I will offer you a job. It doesn't pay quite as much as I wished it did. So I said, as kindly as I could, would you mind telling me? just write it down, you know. So after 2 American and 2 Oxford degrees and some prizes and some 5 books, I was offered $1,250 for teaching freshman English and workshops and contemporary literature, a course I introduced. That's not exactly what you supported a family on, even that long ago. That was little. But a graduate dean offered me another $1,250 on the shady excuse that it was a research grant. You're not supposed to have a research grant and a teaching position at the same time. So there I began, and I had this, if I may say so, absolute vision. After the first workshop meeting, I thought, this is it. I want to get into this. I want to go on teaching writing, teaching contemporary literature, teaching the new English poetry, the new French, German poetry, and get a degree of our own, make writing something. It was a conscious thing. It didn't just happen by blind chance.
Well, when you took over, and I think it was about 1940 is what I could figure out, you formalized the writing program, which is now called the Writers' Workshop. How were you able to attract to Iowa City at the very beginning such remarkable and gifted writers?
As I told you, I grew up in a horse barn. I was accustomed to work. Furthermore, if you have to deal with administrators, it's very wise if before that you learn to deal with horses. You have to learn to be kicked around. No offense to the dean or the president, but I was unknown here. I'd done a few things that they recognized academically, but there was opposition to the writer's workshop. You mustn't think that I was handed it on a platter. There were people who didn't want writers around. One of the senior members of the department told me one night, he'd been drinking quite a lot of ginger ale. He said with a loud voice, we had visitors from Harvard investigating at that time. He said, you know what you ought to do with the writers? Put them in concrete and sink them in the Iowa River. Oh, that was a happy note as I began my life here. I outlived him. I hope I don't say that with too much pleasure. And so I suddenly realized, look, you can't leave it to chance. If you want talent, you got to find out where talent is and then go get it, persuade it, and for that you need money. So I established a chain of friends all around the country. Wally Stegner in Stanford, John Crow Ransom at Kenyon College, Alan Tate at Sewanee, somebody at Columbia, somebody at Harvard, because they didn't have openings for writers. It's all fashionable now. We were the first. Isn't that wonderful? The University of Iowa was the first. And so not only did I locate talent every year, I began trying to raise money. Now, this is, like poetry, an art.
And hard work.
Very hard work, and you have to travel. You don't raise big bucks by staying in Johnson County, which is not a criticism of Johnson County, a place I like. But the big money is there. It's like the guy was asked, why do you rob banks? He says, that's where the money is. So I spent a lot of time. I went to New York 3 or 4 times a year, incidentally, at all times without cost to the university. I never received a penny of reimbursement for travel. I went to California, where I raised around $200,000 in stock, largely. Paid my own way. No regrets. I'd do it again, although it was tough on my little daughters who needed clothes. And so gradually word got around, I was the place. You may have seen Mark Strand's name in the press.
Yes, he attributed his writing. He's the poet laureate of the United States, and he attributed his writing skills and getting it nourished here.
I brought Mark here. He wrote me from Italy when he was finishing his Fulbright and said, I'd like to come and write poetry. And he enclosed some. The minute I read them, I got on the typewriter, and I rushed a letter off to him and said, come, I'll get you a grant. I can't tell you how much now. I didn't have it, but I went out and raised it from Maytag in Newton, from small foundations.
John Deere?
John Deere was one of my most loyal supporters. Foundations in St. Paul, in New York, Ford Foundation I got a good grant from.
Insurance companies, I read.
Rockefeller Foundation, insurance companies. I had no principles at all. I would take money from anybody. And no questions asked, how did you get this?
You have an admiration for businessmen and women, don't you?
You know, you cannot be an idiot and run a corporation involving tens of thousands of people and billions of dollars. I regret saying this, there's a sort of academic snobbishness about businessmen. They're some of the most intelligent people I've ever met, some of the most imaginative, and without them there would be no foundations. You got to make the money before you give it away, you know.
Paul, there are so many writers that that are so famous who have come through here, but there was this wonderful story I read about Fanny OConnor, and I wish you would share that when she first came to Iowa and you met her.
I was sitting in my office one morning. It was in the 1940s. I forget the precise year. And there was a shy knock at the door, and a young lady walked in, and I said, good morning. And to my knowledge, what she said was, I said, oh God, I've got a bad case on my hands. Should I call security? Obviously, she's suffering from some disorder. And she repeated it. And then I said, you know, I'm terribly sorry. I'm very hard of hearing. Would you mind writing it down? I was very embarrassed to do that. And she wrote, my name is Fanny OConnor. I am a fiction writer. She didn't say, I want to come here and study fiction. She said, I am a fiction writer. So I said, you have any stories with you? And she had what I think grandmother used to call a reticule, a kind of string knit bag, and very old. And she opened it up and handed me a story. You know, you read 2 sentences of a genuine writer. You don't need to read to the end. And I said, yes. And she said, I'm not in your department. And I said, you are now. Don't go away.
Was that a little intimidating when you walked into a classroom and had looked out in the sea of faces and there were such wonderful writers? Were you ever intimidated a little?
Only the first day.
Only the first day.
You know, because this happens so often. I was used to it. For example, Mark Strand, who's just been given the top poetry position in this country. He was in a class that in the same time that D. Snodgrass was there. He won the Pulitzer Prize on the first manuscript and book. He wrote it all in my poetry workshop. Marvin Bell was in it. Donald Justice was in it. And it was exactly like a lion walking into a den of Daniels. I mean, you're scared to death of that kind of talent. And I got put down constantly. I read a poem by a man in the workshop, which I thought had a weak last line. I said, look, the last line's so much worse than all the rest of the poem. Everything in the poem up to the last line deserves a better last line. Silence. And finally I said, you have nothing to say? Usually you talk all the time. And he looked at me and said with contempt, I mean real, beautifully poised contempt, the New Yorker took it yesterday. So why change the last line?
Well, there you have that.
But I worked for talent, and I worked to support it, and it poured in here like mad. But don't forget, the foreign writers have been coming. Not as much now. The funds were taken away by the federal government, which Wilding and I spent 4 years persuading to send their support. And lots of them were eminent people.
Let's talk about, I'd like to touch on the international writing program because it has been so successful, and I read comments by writers a French writer who said, my goodness, it was a chance of a lifetime and I couldn't have afforded to do this thing on my own. And a writer from Greece went home with a different impression of the United States, saying, it's not like it is in the movies. I have a new understanding. So besides nourishing writers' international writing program, you also were kind of tilling the soil of international understanding.
All my life I've been turning up dirt. And it just happens to be foreign dirt, but I could learn to identify talent. Apparently, I had a small talent for recognizing talent very early. You know, one line or one good image in a poem, you can build on that. You can take someone and shape it. And so the foreign writers are devoted to Iowa City and the university. They had a great time here, mostly they did. And letters pour in. I published a whole book called The World Comes to Iowa. Have you ever seen it?
No, I haven't.
I'll send you a copy.
Okay.
No bill will come. And strange results. For example, my wife, Heartland, she's just finished a novel, which is the only one ever set in Iowa and in China. It's set actually in Stone City, Iowa, where I spent my 25 summers with my girls. And it's not autobiography. It's a marvelous story of a girl who was born in China of a Chinese mother and an American father. And the father was killed in China. And he was there during the war. And she comes one summer to visit her grandparents, her father's parents, and they live in Stone City. And it's a wonderful story of suspicion, affection, reconciliation, misunderstanding, understanding. There is talk of making a film of it, and I think it would make a marvelous film. And of course, China is in the news. I've been to China quite a lot with Hualing, and when we go to China, we don't just stay in tourist hotels. We see the people.
Do you stay in the writers' homes that you have been here?
They don't have room for that.
They don't have room for that.
Oh, no, you mustn't think of homes as houses. They don't have them.
Like all of your honors and contributions and the workshop and the international program, is there one that you're the most pleased about? Is there one of these things that you've done, or is it the whole broad spectrum?
Of course, the things which have given me the greatest happiness are 4 daughters, 5 grandchildren.
Congratulations.
Do you want me to quote some remarks from the grandchildren?
Sure.
I put my grandson to bed here in Iowa City last summer. They come every summer. They live around the world. They were in Beijing 3 years. Now they're in Bonn. Before they were in Portugal, Brazil. And he was, last summer, he was 4. And I put him to bed and said, okay, his name is Christoph. See you in the morning. Go to sleep. About an hour later, I heard rustling downstairs. I thought, So I went down, and there he was, standing up in bed, not complaining. He's the happiest kid I ever saw in my life. And just sort of quietly shaking the bed in a friendly way. I said, Christoph, why aren't you asleep? In my best grandfatherly tone. And he looked at me a minute, and he said, Grandpa, I'm too happy to go to sleep.
Oh.
Okay, you can't beat a kid. So I will put that first. Living with Hualing is an incredible experience because she is an expert fiction writer herself. And I've learned a very great deal about China, enough about China to make me wish that the President of the United States did not view himself as an expert on China when he does these extraordinary kindnesses to the bunch of murderers who are now running China. They simply laugh at him. They think he's a fool because he gets loans of hundreds of millions for them. He does all kinds of recognitions. They don't deserve it. They're butchers. And they will ultimately, of course, die. My God, they're as old as I am. They haven't got long for this world, you know.
So your grandchildren, your children, your wife, you're writing, I'm sure.
The programs I take great pleasure in because there was a thing called the Writers' Workshop when I came here. It had only 8 students, all of them brilliantly untalented. But it was a beginning. And it grew, and I worked. I was trained to work. You're put on the face of the earth to work. That's why you're here. You praise God by working. God himself being regarded as a terribly hard worker. You can't create worlds without work. And then the International Writing Program, which was Hualing's idea. She said, you have a program for Americans, why don't you have one for foreign writers? You bring foreign writers here. She came here as an established novelist, not as a student. And I said, well, it's crazy. How will you find them and how will you fund them? And she looked at me and pointed her finger and said, you did it with the Writers' Workshop, you can do it with this. And I said, with your help. So we did it together. But it was her concept. And then I persuaded the university to start the translation workshop, the first of its kind, just as the Writers' Workshop was the first. The International Writing Program is the only one in the world. And it's difficult because you've got to raise all of that money. $10,000 for every person who comes here.
You just received a wonderful award for all your work you've done in the workshops and the International Writing Program. It was awarded by the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. And it was the service to the arts. And Kurt Vonnegut, who once taught here, nominated you. You're in quite good company with Leopold Stokowski and Isaac Stern and George Balanchine and Martha Graham. Were you just really surprised when this award came?
No, overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed.
I didn't expect it. I had never heard of it.
It's not given every year, I read.
No, it's given only when the Academy feels it has found someone who has given, and I now quote, this is not Paul Engle's remark, distinguished service to the arts, which they allege that I have given. And Kurt wrote the citation in which he lied in his teeth. But lies are beautiful, you know. And read it at the ceremony, and there were just under 1,000 people in the audience, leading people in all of the arts, because the Academy gives awards in painting and composition and so on. And it was a very great occasion, and I must say, they told me afterwards, this is the first time the University of Iowa has ever been mentioned from this platform. I wasn't sure if they meant this kindly or not, you know.
Paul, I have only time for 2 more questions. One is, looking back, who influenced you? Who's kind of shaped you? Many people? Couple people?
A lot. I was very lucky in the people I've known. Wonderful people. Like my American friend who had these houses scattered everywhere. As it turned out, they were in exactly the places I wanted to go and live. And people like Robert Frost, I lived on his farm at South Shaftesbury, Vermont, one summer. He gave it to us. Puncheon floors. Boards were this wide. I have an unpublished manuscript from that house about a summer when they went camping on Lake Winnipesaukee. It's a marvelous story. It should be published one day. And it was written by one of his daughters, and I had permission to take a copy. I lived with him there. I flew with Robert Frost the first time he ever went up in a plane. We were in South Miami, where a novelist called Hervey Allen had... He'd made a lot of money on a novel, and instead of building a great house, he built 5 or 6 little houses in about 10 acres and invited his friends to stay with him. So Frost lived in one little house, and I lived in another little house with my wife. And late at night, I would always hear the same noise. He had a recorder made of some sort of fruit wood, pear, I think, and he couldn't sleep. He had this disaster of sleeplessness. And so I would walk with him every night, all around these little lanes made of crushed coral. And then finally, I would get sleepy, and we'd go back, and then he'd go and walk more. When he came back, he would get out his recorder. He knew, I think, 3 tunes, and he would play them over and over and over. And when they stopped, I knew they'd put him to sleep.
It's a great story. What are you working on now? Are you working on your memoirs?
Not as hard as I should.
Well?
I've gotten perhaps 300 pages, but it should be about 800. I find it very difficult to decide whether what I remember is really what I should remember. Is it the truth, what I remember? Is it wrong? Is it distorted? Have I looked at myself more kindly than I should? I look at myself less kindly as I get older. I'll be 82 very quickly. Not before I leave here, however. And that's tough. I've written some poems also about my life. 2 books, Engle Country Memoirs, Engle Country Poems.
That leads me into the last thing. Would you read Heartland? That wonderful poem that you sent me a copy of.
Maybe it's too long for you for me to
would you read part of it?
See, it's quite long.
Yes.
And
Do you have
I
your
would like to
glasses?
say I'm also doing with Hua Ling another book, joint book called Chance.
Where How You Met. I read it.
Well, the story of how we met.
Paul, will you share part of your poem, Heartland, with us?
This is a poem not yet in a book. It's from the next book. Heartland. Apollo spacecraft 100 miles high sees the 1,000-mile-long Midwest as a woman's body lying on the earth, her head a cool Itasca to the north, her feet in the Gulf of Mexico to the south. Out of that beautiful body I was born. Great-grandfather Peter Reinheimer broke our piece of Iowa prairie, the first man from the world's beginning to tear that gold-green grass apart. Great-grandmother gardened, baked, bore kids, slopped hogs, picked corn, fed Indians, seldom cried. Her spirit smooth as a hickory axe handle. They flew to this new place from the old country to spit their past out like a bitter fruit, to kick their yesterday in the teeth as a barefoot boy will kick a little stone. Grandmother did two things marvelously well. One, a hickory cake, cracking the hard nuts with a flared hammer on the same flat iron she heated over a wood-burning range to smooth grandfather's Sunday shirt. Two, bearing my mother in her own blunt image. One night when I was 10 and fever sick, scared of the night, scared of my body's heat, Mother beat back the darkness from my bed, her blue eyes streaming tears, her white hands streaming light. Tough Tom Engle, hands on hips, the rough words jumping from his lips, toward friend or strangers jutting his jaw, staring at horses for any delicate flaw. Mountain to mountain, rich fields roll, oceans of soil above an ocean of stone. This land rolls onward with the rolling world, a place of trust in a time not to be trusted. 5 lines, which I wrote as dedication to a book called Images of China. It is dedicated to Hualing. There is a time bomb on top of my neck. It is called Paul Engle's head. It is set to go off whenever it doesn't see you. It is tired of exploding. Don't go away. Don't go away. Don't go away. Why? Because you taught me to make wood out of a fire.
My guest has been Paul Engle, poet, teacher, prose writer, manager, fundraiser, practical visionary, and U of I Professor Emeritus of Creative Writing. During his long and distinguished career, he has published more than a dozen books of poetry, as well as a novel, opera libretto, several prose works, and edited anthologies. He has received many honors over the years, the most recent being the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters Service to the Arts Award. Paul Engle's guiding force and leadership helped shape the Writers' Workshop, and his co-directing of the International Writing Program inspired and touched hundreds of writers across the world. An amazing story, an amazing man, an amazing career.